at the heart of Eastern Europe. While people continue their daily lives as usual, a major upheaval is unfolding behind a veil of tension. US President Joe Biden has made a bold and unprecedented move by authorizing Ukraine to deploy the Army Tactical Missile System, which is also referred to as ATACMS, a long-range weapon capable of striking deep into Russian territory. This decision marks a significant escalation in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, creating shock waves in global politics and security. Major powers like the United States and NATO becomes increasingly involved in this struggle. The level of risk has reached unprecedented heights. This crucial decision not only intensifies current tensions, but also threatens to reshape the geopolitical landscape, raising urgent questions about the future of international relations and global stability. The origins of the Russia-Ukraine conflict can be traced back to dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, when Ukraine became an independent nation but retained deep historical, cultural, and political ties with Russia. In February 2014, tensions escalated between Russia and Ukraine when Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, an action widely condemned by the international community. Subsequently, pro-Russian separatist groups in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine declared independence, leading to a prolonged conflict between the Ukrainian government forces and separatists supported by Russia. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, expanding the conflict nationwide. This war has had severe humanitarian and economic consequences, not only for Ukraine, but also globally. Rising oil prices and disruptions to supply chains are among the notable economic repercussions. Over the years, the United States and NATO have provided various forms of support to Ukraine, ranging from economic aid to military assistance, aiming to strengthen Ukraine's sovereignty and counter Russia's aggression. In November 2024, President Joe Biden made a decisive move by authorizing Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles within Russia territory. This decision was driven by intensification of the conflict, notably the deployment of North Korean troops assisting Russia on the battlefield. The presence of these foreign troops signaled the potential escalation in the war, prompting the United States to enhance its military support for Ukraine as a deterrent and a means to balance the power dynamics on the group. The ATACMS, developed by Lockheed Martin, is a highly sophisticated missile system capable of striking targets up to 300 kilometers away with precision, previously restricted to operations within Ukraine borders in Crimea. The authorization to use ATACMS in Russian territory represents a significant strategic shift. This decision not only amplifies Ukraine's offensive capabilities, but also sends a clear message to both Russian forces and international observers about the United States' commitment to supporting Ukraine. The ATACMS is a surface-to-surface missile system designed for long-range strikes against high-value targets. Its range allows Ukrainian forces to engage strategic Russian assets such as military bases, command centers, and logistical hubs, which were previously beyond the reach of stranded artillery and shorter-range missile systems like HIMARS. The precision-guided nature of ATACMS reduces collateral damage, making it a potent tool for targeting specific military installations without causing widespread destruction. From a strategic standpoint, the deployment of ATACMS missiles enhances Ukraine's ability to disrupt Russian supply lines and communication networks, thereby weakening Russia's operational effectiveness. The ability to strike deep within Russian territory also serves as a psychological deterrent, potentially limiting Russia's willingness to commit additional forces or escalate the conflict further. Ukraine's first utilization of ATACMS missiles on November 19, 2024, marked a significant milestone in the conflict. The targeted strike against the weapons depot in the Bryansk region demonstrated Ukraine's enhanced offensive capabilities and the tangible impact of U.S. military support. While Russia has disputed the extent of the damage, reports indicate significant disruption to Russian military logistics and a temporary setback in their operational plans.
The successful deployment of ATACMS missiles has broader implications for the battlefield dynamics that allows the Ukrainian forces to take the fight directly to Russian strategic assets, potentially reducing the effectiveness of Russian offensives and providing Ukraine with greater leverage in both military engagements and future negotiations.
19 ноября
Russia's reaction to authorization of ATACMS missiles by the United States has been one of condemnation and threats of escalation.
наши войска успешно наступают по всей линии боевого соприкосновения. Все задачи, которые мы перед собой ставим, будут решены. В ответ на применение американского и британского дальнобойного оружия 21 ноября текущего года российские вооруженные силы нанесли комбинированный удар по одному из объектов оборонно-промышленного комплекса Украины.
Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, have framed the decision as a direct escalation of the conflict, equating it to NATO's involvement. In response, Russia has revised its nuclear doctrine, lowering the threshold for nuclear retaliation in scenarios where it perceives a direct threat to its sovereignty or existence. This shift signifies a willingness to consider extreme measures, including the use of nuclear weapons, in response to perceived existential threats. While actual deployment of nuclear weapons remains highly unlikely due to the catastrophic consequences it would entail, the mere revision of nuclear doctrine heightens tensions and increases the risk of miscalculations that could lead to unintended escalation. The authorization for Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles indirectly implicates NATO member states, as the provision of such advanced weaponry comes from the alliance's collective defense framework. While NATO as an organization may not be directly engaged in combat operations, the support extended to Ukraine blurs the lines of direct involvement, potentially inviting Russian retaliation against NATO member states. This situation poses a significant strategic dilemma for NATO. On one hand, there is a need to support Ukraine to maintain the balance of power and uphold international law against aggression. On the other hand, direct involvement risks dragging member states into a broader conflict with Russia, which could have far-reaching global implications, including the possibility of a nuclear confrontation. The decision to enable Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory with ATACMS missiles has profound geopolitical consequences. Regionally, it alters the balance of power in Eastern Europe, potentially emboldening Ukraine and its allies, while demoralizing Russian forces. This shift could lead to a prolonged conflict, with both sides investing more resources and escalating their military strategies. Globally, the increased involvement of the United States and NATO in the conflict elevates the stakes, potentially drawing in other international actors and alliances. Countries observing the conflict may reassess their own security policies and alliances in response to the change in dynamics, leading to a more polarized and tense international environment. The utilization of long-range missiles like ATACMS inherently carries the risk of civilian casualties and extensive infrastructural damage. While the precision of these weapons aims to minimize collateral damage, the reality of war means that unintended consequences are inevitable. Civilian populations in targeted regions may suffer from direct hits or the resultant destruction, leading to loss of life, injuries, and displacement as well. Furthermore, the intensified conflict and increased military operations can exacerbate the humanitarian crisis, leading to larger waves of refugees fleeing the conflict zones. The international community faces the challenge of addressing these humanitarian needs while navigating the complex political and military landscape of the conflict. The authorization of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine positions the country with greater leverage in any potential future negotiations with Russia. The ability to strike deep into Russian territory provides Ukraine with tangible concessions it can offer in exchange for peace or territorial agreements. However, this also complicates diplomatic efforts, as Russia's revised nuclear doctrine and threats of retaliation increases the stakes and reduces the likelihood of a peaceful resolution in the near term. The potential for escalation remains a significant concern, with both sides bolstering their military capabilities and international involvement intensifying. The risk of the conflict expanding beyond regional boundaries into a broader international confrontation is heightened. The involvement of nuclear-armed states in rhetoric and policy increases the global security risks, making the situation precarious and unpredictable. The use of ATACMS missiles within Russia territory raises significant legal and ethical questions under international law. The principle of sovereignty dictates that one nation cannot conduct military operations within the borders of another without consent, barring self-defense in response to an ongoing attack. While Ukraine's actions are framed as defensive against Russian aggression, striking deep into Russian territory can be interpreted as an offensive act, potentially violating international norms and laws. Moreover, the provision of such weaponry by the United States, a major global power, implicates broader questions about the role of international actors in sovereign conflicts. The ethical implications of escalating the conflict through advanced weaponry must be weighed against the perceived necessity of supporting Ukraine's defense and deterring further aggression. Amidst the military escalation, diplomatic efforts remain crucial in seeking a resolution to the conflict. The international community, including the United States and various diplomatic corps, must prioritize dialogue and negotiation to prevent further deterioration of the situation. Establishing clear communication channels between Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and the United States is essential to manage tensions and avoid miscalculations that could lead to unintended escalations. Peace talks must address the underlying issues driving the conflict, including territorial disputes, security assurances, and the rights and autonomy of affected regions. International mediation can play a pivotal role in facilitating these discussions, ensuring that all parties have a stake in the negotiation outcomes and are committed to a sustainable peace agreement. Beyond its practical impact, ATACMS also exerts substantial psychological pressure on Russia, diminishing the morale of its soldiers, who now face the threat of being targeted deep within their own territory. The concentration of efforts to protect the rear can disperse Russia's resources, reducing their effectiveness on the front lines. Conversely, Ukraine benefits both psychologically and politically, with enhanced confidence and potential to receive increased support from the international community. ATACMS serves not only as a strategic tool, but also as a crucial lever in the conflict with Russia. The use of long-range missiles like ATACMS increases the likelihood of deeper international involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Countries with strategic interests in Eastern Europe, such as NATO members or Russia's allies, may feel pressure to take sides, leading to the complicating and expansion of the conflict dynamics. Western nations might bolster support for Ukraine, while Russia could receive additional aid from partners like China or Iran, escalating the situation. The risk of the conflict spreading to neighboring countries, especially NATO nations, could trigger Article 5, leading to direct confrontation between Russia and the West. Globally, more distant countries might also adjust their security strategies to cope with the rising tensions, raising the risk of prolonged instability and a new arms race. This escalation not only threatens the region, but also significantly impacts international peace and stability. The escalation of the conflict has significant economic implications, both regionally and globally. Increased military operations and international involvement can lead to the imposition of more stringent sanctions against Russia, further isolating its economy and limiting its access to global markets and financial systems. This economic pressure aims to deter further aggression, but can also have unintended consequences, such as global supply chain disruptions and increased energy prices. The economic strain on Russia may lead to internal pressures, potentially affecting its domestic stability and political landscape. Conversely, the extended conflict and increased military expenditure can strain Ukraine's economy, necessitating continued international financial support to sustain its defense efforts. The use of advanced missile systems like ATACMS highlights the evolving nature of modern warfare, where precision and long-range capabilities are becoming increasingly vital. The integration of such technologies into Ukraine's military strategy underscores the importance of technological superiority in the contemporary conflicts. This trend may influence future military engagements, with nations investing more in advanced weaponry and defense systems to gain strategic advantages. Moreover, the development of these systems raises questions about the proliferation of advanced military technologies and the potential for their use in other conflicts. Ensuring the responsible transfer and utilization of such technologies is essential to prevent escalation and maintain global security. The intensified conflict and increased use of advanced weaponry raises serious concerns regarding human rights and international accountability. The potential for civilian casualties and destruction of infrastructure necessitates stringent adherence to international humanitarian laws and norms. The international community must monitor the conflict to ensure that all parties comply with legal standards and protect civilian lives and property. Accountability mechanisms must be in place to address violations and hold responsible parties accountable for breaches of international law. This approach is essential to maintain global norms and prevent normalization of such escalatory measures in future conflicts. The authorization of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine by President Joe Biden represents a significant escalation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, with far-reaching implications for regional and global security. This decision enhances Ukraine's military capabilities, providing it with the tools to strike deep within Russian territory and potentially alter the strategic balance of the conflict. However, it also raises the stakes, increasing the risk of broader conflict escalation, including potential retaliatory actions against NATO member states and the ominous specter of nuclear confrontation. The geopolitical consequences extend beyond the immediate conflict, influencing international relations, economic stability, and global security dynamics. Diplomatic efforts must be intensified to seek a resolution to the conflict, emphasizing dialogue and negotiation to prevent further deterioration. The international community faced the challenge of balancing support for Ukraine's sovereignty with the imperative to prevent a broader and more destructive war. Ultimately, the situation underscores the delicate balance between military support and diplomatic engagement in addressing conflicts that have profound implications for global peace and stability. As the conflict evolves, continuous monitoring, strategic foresight, and robust diplomatic initiatives will be crucial in navigating the complexities of this high-stakes geopolitical crisis.
The history of Ukraine and Russia is intertwined in complex and often contentious ways, rooted deeply in the region's past. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine has been at the center of geopolitical struggles, with Russia persistently challenging its sovereignty. Known as the breadbasket of Soviet Russia, Ukraine has remained politically, military, and economically crucial to Russia, driving ongoing disputes over its independence. This article delves into the 1,000-year history of Ukraine, tracing the origins of the conflict and why Russia continues to view Ukraine as a vital part of its sphere of influence. The story of Ukraine begins in the early medieval period with the Kievan Rus, a powerful federation of Slavic tribes that dominated Eastern Europe from the 9th to the 13th centuries. The state was centered around Kiev, which served as the political, cultural, and spiritual heart of the Rus people. The Norse traders, predominantly of Swedish origin, navigated the river routes from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, establishing trade connections and settlements along the way. These traders merged with Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic tribes, becoming known as the Rus. Kiev was often referred to as the mother of Rus cities, signifying its importance as the capital of the Kievan Rus state. The rulers of this region were styled as Grand Princes of Kiev, and the city became the spiritual and cultural center for the Rus people. This period marked the beginnings of Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian identities, creating a shared heritage that still influences modern perceptions. The association of Kiev with the early heritage of the Rus state laid the groundwork for the present-day tensions between Ukraine and Russia. To many in Russia, Kiev represents the cradle of Russian civilization, and its historical ties create a sense of entitlement,
over Ukrainian territory. This 1,000-year-old connection is the foundation of Russia's claim over Ukraine and continues to influence its actions today. The unity of the Kievan Rus was shattered by the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. In 1223, the Mongol horde launched its first assault on the Rus states, culminating in the decisive battle of the Kalka River. Although the Mongols temporarily withdrew, they returned in 1237 to conquer the Kievan Rus definitively. This invasion marked the beginning of the fragmentation of the Rus territories and left much of Ukraine under the dominion of the Golden Horde for centuries. During this period of Mongol rule, power shifted away from Kiev, and the Grand Duchy of Moscow began to rise as a new focal point for the Rus people. This shift set the stage for Moscow's emergence as the center of Russian power, which would later influence Russian imperial ambitions in the region. As the Golden Horde's control weakened, Ukraine found itself under the influence of neighboring powers. By the 14th century, much of Ukraine had been absorbed into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This period saw the rise of the Cossacks, a fiercely independent warrior society closely associated with Ukraine. The Cossacks resisted the control of the foreign powers, often rebelling against Polish rule and seeking closer ties with Moscow. The Cossacks, who were deeply linked to Ukraine's cultural and historical identity, played a pivotal role in shaping the region's future. In the mid-17th century, the Cossack leader Bohdan Khmelnytsky led a rebellion against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, seeking to unite Ukraine with Russia under the protection of the Russian Tsar. This culminated in the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654, which formalized an alliance between the Cossacks and Russia. The treaty marked a turning point in Ukrainian history as it brought much of Ukraine under Russian influence. The Russian state, which had been slowly forming from disparate territories, welcomed the Cossacks' allegiance. For many Ukrainians, the treaty symbolized a connection to the broader Rus heritage and provided a measure of protection against Polish domination. However, it also marked the beginning of Russian encroachment on Ukrainian sovereignty. Moscow used the treaty to justify its claims over Ukraine, portraying it as an act of reunification that brought all Rus people under one banner. This narrative would later be exploited by the Soviet Union, which framed the treaty as a historical moment of unity between Russia and Ukraine, overlooking the complex and often reluctant nature of the Cossacks' decision. Crimea has long been a significant battleground in the history of Ukraine and Russia. Originally part of the Crimean Khanate, a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, Crimea was strategically important due to its location on the Black Sea. After a series of conflicts between the Russian and Ottoman empires, Catherine the Great annexed Crimea in 1783, formally incorporating it into the Russian Empire. This annexation was not met with resistance by the Crimean Tatars, and it was later recognized by the Ottoman Empire. Russia's control of Crimea cemented its dominance in the Black Sea region, allowing it to expand its naval and military capabilities. Crimea's annexation became a defining moment in Russia's imperial history, setting a precedent for future expansions into Ukrainian territory. Throughout the 19th century, Russian imperial policies increasingly sought to suppress Ukrainian identity. Ukrainian language and culture were viewed as threats to the unity of the Russian Empire, leading to efforts to eradicate them. In 1804, the teaching of the Ukrainian language was banned in schools, and this policy was extended in 1876 to prohibit the republication of books and performances in Ukrainian. These measures were aimed at integrating Ukraine more fully into the Russian state and preventing separatist movements. The 19th century was a period of intense Russification, as the Russian Empire sought to suppress the growing sense of Ukrainian national identity. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, which saw Russia pitted against a coalition of the Ottoman Empire, France, and the United Kingdom, was a significant conflict that exposed the empire's weaknesses. The war's outcome, marked by the loss of key battles and the Treaty of Paris, prevented Russia from maintaining a naval presence in the Black Sea, highlighting the strategic importance of Ukraine and Crimea. During this period, Russia authorities continued to view Ukrainians as Little Russians, a term that denied the existence of a distinct Ukrainian nation. The growing separatist sentiment among Ukrainians was seen as a direct threat to the stability of the Russian Empire. By the late 19th century, oppressive measures were intensified, with prohibitions on Ukrainian language, publications, plays, and public lectures. These efforts to suppress Ukrainian culture were met with resistance and only fueled a stronger sense of national identity among Ukrainians. The struggle for cultural and political autonomy would come to a head in the early 20th century, as the tides of revolution swept across the Russian Empire. The Russian Revolution of 1917 brought an end to the imperial era and briefly allowed Ukraine to declare independence. However, this independence was short-lived, as Ukraine was soon absorbed into the newly formed Soviet Union in 1922. As part of the USSR, Ukraine's agricultural potential was exploited to support a Soviet state, earning it the title of the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Under Soviet rule, Ukraine faced some of the darkest chapters in its history. The Holodomor of 1932 to 1933, a man-made famine orchestrated by Stalin's regime, devastated the country. Soviet policies forcibly seized Ukrainian crops and livestock, exporting them abroad to finance industrialization while millions of Ukrainians starved. The Holodomor is widely regarded as an act of genocide, with estimates of up to 4 million deaths. During World War II, Ukraine once again found itself at the center of conflict. Nazi Germany invaded 1941, promising Ukrainian independence but quickly reneging on that pledge. The occupation was brutal, with millions of Ukrainians killed, including 1.5 million Jews. The Soviet Red Army eventually reclaimed Ukraine, but the war left deep scars, with between 5 and 7 million Ukrainians losing their lives. After the war, Ukraine remained under tight Soviet control, enduring further hardships, including a severe famine in 1946 to 1947. The rebuilding process was slow, and pre-war levels of food production were not restored until the 1960s. In 1954, the USSR transferred control of Crimea to Soviet Ukraine, a symbolic gesture that would later sow the seeds of future conflicts. One of the most catastrophic events of the Soviet era was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. A failed test at Reactor 4 led to a catastrophic meltdown, releasing vast amounts of radiation into the atmosphere. Chernobyl remains one of the worst nuclear disasters in history, and its impact was felt across Europe. The disaster eroded public trust in the Soviet government and was cited by Mikhail Gorbachev as a turning point that accelerated the USSR's collapse. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine declared its independence. A referendum held later that year saw over 90% of voters supporting independence, signaling a clear desire to break away from Moscow's control. Ukraine's newfound sovereignty, however, came with significant challenges, including the issue of its nuclear arsenal. At the time of independence, Ukraine was the third largest holder of nuclear weapons in the world. However, the control systems for these weapons remained in Russian hands. In 1994, Ukraine agreed to dismantle its nuclear stockpile in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom through the Budapest Memorandum. These assurances were meant to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but they would be called into question just 2 decades later. In the early 2000s, Ukraine's internal politics were marked by widespread corruption and influence from Moscow. The 2004 presidential election, marred by allegations of fraud, sparked the Orange Revolution, a series of protests and strikes across the country demanding fair elections. The movement successfully overturned the election results, and pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko was eventually declared the winner. The Orange Revolution was a pivotal moment in modern Ukrainian history, as it highlighted the growing divide between pro-Russian and pro-Western factions within the country. It also reinforced a distinct Ukrainian national identity separate from Russia. In 2010, the Ukrainian court posthumously convicted Soviet leaders, including Joseph Stalin, of genocide during the Holodomor, further distancing Ukraine from its Soviet past. Tensions continued to simmer in Ukraine, culminating in the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, also known as the Maidan Revolution. The protests were triggered by President Viktor Yanukovych's refusal to sign an association agreement with the European Union, a move seen as aligning Ukraine more closely with Russia. The Soviet clashes between protesters and security forces resulted in over 130 deaths and led to Yanukovych's ousting. The revolution marked a significant turning point in Ukraine's relationship with Russia. In response to the political upheaval, pro-Russian uprisings erupted in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donbas region. Russia was widely suspected of orchestrating these uprisings. An armed conflict soon broke out, a war that continues to this day. In 2014, Russia also took the dramatic step of annexing Crimea, citing historical claims and the need to protect Russian-speaking citizens. The annexation was widely condemned by the international community, which viewed it as a blatant violation of international law. Crimea's strategic importance, particularly a naval base at Sevastopol, made it a valuable asset for Russia, but the move further strained relations with Ukraine and the West. The annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine have kept the region in a state of turmoil. In 2019, Ukraine amended its constitution to enshrine closer ties with NATO and the EU, heightening Russian fears of Western encroachment on its borders. For Russia, Ukraine serves as a critical buffer zone between itself and Western Europe, and any shift towards NATO is seen as a direct threat to Russian security. Economically, Ukraine remains a vital player in global food supply chain. As the world's largest exporter of sunflower oil and a major supplier of grain, Ukraine's agricultural sector has drawn significant international interest. In 2021, Ukraine lifted a ban on the sale of farmland, opening the door to greater investment but also raising concerns about foreign influence in its domestic affairs. The geopolitical struggle over Ukraine is reminiscent of the Cold War, drawing comparisons to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, just as the US viewed Soviet missiles in Cuba as an unacceptable threat. Russia perceives Ukraine's alignment with the West as an existential danger. The stakes are high, and the possibility of further escalation looms large. Isn't just about borders or ethnic identity. It is a battle for sovereignty and the right to determine its own future. Russia's view of Ukraine as a lost province rather than an independent state drives much of the conflict. The deep historical, cultural, and strategic ties between the two nations complicate any efforts at resolution.
For Ukraine, the path forward lies in solidifying its national identity and pursuing closer integration with Western institutions. For Russia, maintaining influence over Ukraine is seen as crucial to preserving its own security and legacy. The challenge lies in finding a sustainable, peaceful solution that acknowledges the historical connections without undermining Ukraine's right to self-determination.
The relationship between Ukraine and Russia is shaped by a complex shared history from the Kievan Rus to the Soviet era. While Ukraine seeks independence and alignment with the West, Russia clings to its imperial past. The ongoing conflict underscores the urgent need for diplomacy, as a stable Ukraine is crucial for regional and global security. History's lessons must guide us to prevent further conflict.
So are you ready to discover more history secrets? Subscribe to My History and never miss an ancient history documentary that rewrites everything you ever knew.